Welcome to Shahnameh, Book of Kings. Today we continue with the tale of Bahram Gur. A horseman rode out from Qanuj with the news that Borzu and his Persian entourage had left, taking the king's daughter with them. When Shangal heard this, he came from the hunting grounds like a raging fire. With a group of soldiers, he pursued Bahram until he reached the banks of the river and saw Bahram and Sepanad on the other shore. In his fury, he crossed the river in the twinkling of an eye, and he said to his daughter, "May no king ever have a child like you. This man deceived you, and away you flew to cross this river without telling me. You're leaving our celestial sanctuary. For what? A ruined, impoverished land? You know the force of this spear in my hand. If you think you'll call simply leave my side, and without warning run away and hide." Bahram said to her, "You wretch! Why have you ridden here like a fool? You've put me to the test, and you know that I'm such a man on a battlefield as I am at banquets and wine drinking. You know that 100,000 Indians against me count for less than one knight. If I and my 30 companions are armored and have Persian swords, we can fill the land of India with blood and leave not one person alive." Shangal knew that he spoke the truth, because there was no denying his courage, his fighting ability. Shangal said to him, "You were dearer to me than my own eyes. I preferred you to my children and to all my family. I put a crown on your head and gave you the bride you wanted. I acted justly towards you, and you acted deceitfully. You chose treachery instead of loyalty, and when has it ever been right to return loyalty with treachery? What can I say of a man whom I treated as my own son, whom I believe to be wise, and who now acts like a belligerent knight, or as though he were the king himself? When was a Persian ever loyal? When a Persian says yes, he's thinking no. This is just how a lion cub acts. Its keeper cares for it and soaks it in its tears, but when it cuts its teeth and its claws become sharp, all it wants to do is fight with whoever brought it up." Bahram replied, "When you know who I am, you will not blame me for my acts or slander my good name. I am the King of Kings, and my commands are absolute throughout the warlike lands of Persia and Turan. From now on, you will reap the benefits of all I do. You'll be my father here, and I won't say where is the tax your country has to pay. Your daughter is the eastern candle flame, who crowns all other women with her fame." Shangal was astonished at his words. He tore his Indian turban from his head and urged his horse forward, so that he left his troops and stood before the king. In his happiness, he embraced Bahram, asked pardon for what he had said, and commanded that a meal and wine be prepared. Bahram explained everything that had been hidden from him, telling him all the details of what had happened. They drank a quantity of wine, and then rose, and each asked pardon of the other. And the two brave, God-fearing kings clasped hands in promise of mutual devotion, saying, "Our hearts will never break this loyalty, and will uproot the tree of treachery. The friendship that we swear to will abide forever now, with wisdom as our guide." Shangal bade farewell to Sepanad, embracing her as though his chest were the warp and hers the weft of one cloth. Then the two kings quickly turned from one another, having abandoned all the rancor that was in their hearts. Happily and in haste they set out, one over dry land and the other over water. When news reached Iran that the king and his entourage had returned from Qanuj, all the streets and towns along the way were decorated to welcome him, and everyone took part in this scattering of gold and silver coins, musk and saffron. Bahram's son Yastagerd called the scattered troops together to form a welcoming party, and Nursi and the chief priest accompanied him. When Bahram's son saw his father, he went forward and pressed his face against the dust, as did Bahram's brother Nursi and the chief priest, and though their faces were dusty, their hearts were filled with happiness. And so the king progressed towards his palace, entrusting his body and soul to God. The world turned dark, and he rested. The moon was like a silver shield in the sky. When day tore night's dark shirt, and the candle that lights the world appeared in the sky, the King of Kings sat on his golden throne. The doors to his audience hall were opened, and his lips were closed. The nobles, wise men, and client rulers of the realm came before him. Bahram rose and addressed them with words of advice and wisdom. His nobles responded with congratulations and by calling down blessings on his head. Then the king mounted his horse, and he and his courtiers rode to the fire temple of Azar-Gashhap. There he distributed a great quantity of gold and silver to the poor, giving more to those who tried to conceal their need from him. The keepers of the flame of Zarathustra came to him with gifts and the secret Barsom, and Bahram presented Seponod to them. They taught her the principles of the faith and bathed her in pure water, so that she was cleansed of all corruption, dust, and dirt. Bahram opened the prison gates, freeing the prisoners, and gave money liberally to those who were in need. After Seponod had been made Bahram's wife for some time, and had told her father of Bahram's exploits, Shangal desired to go to Iran. He sent an eloquent and noble Median messenger to request that a new treaty be drawn up between them, and Bahram one that he could keep in his palace as evidence of their friendship. Bahram responded with a new treaty that was as fair as the sun shining over a celestial garden. He also wrote a letter in Pahlavi script that the messenger took to Shangal. The king of India then made preparations to travel to Iran, and had all this from his Chinese father-in-law. 7 kings came to Shangal's court to accompany him on his journey, including the king of Kabul, Sandal, and who came with his entourage, the noble Mandal, and the powerful Jandal. All were great kings, eager for fame. They wore torques and earrings and were resplendent in jewels, gold, and silver. Parasols of peacock feathers were held over their heads, and their elephants were draped in brocade. The caravan's splendor could be seen for miles as they traveled, taking gifts for Bahram, even though he despised such wealth. They went forward stage by stage, and when Bahram heard of their approach, nobles from every town went out to welcome them. The King of Kings traveled as far as Naravan, and there the 2 great monarchs met and dismounted, each offering greetings and apologies for the trouble the other had taken. These 2 crowned glorious kings embraced one another, while their escorts dismounted, and the world was filled with a hubbub of greetings. The 2 kings traveled on horseback, side by side, gossiping of this and that until they reached Bahram's palace, where a gold throne was placed ready for Shangal, and imperial robes were given to him. The tables spread for the feast stretched for a bow shot, and were piled with lamb and spit-roasted chicken. Musicians sang, and wine was brought, so that from one end of the feast to the other, all glasses were full. A splendid space for talk and relaxation, with attentive servants, had been prepared for after the meal, and the whole palace and its grounds seemed like a paradise. The wine flasks were all of crystal, and sat out on golden trays, and other trays were piled with musk, while the stewards wore golden diadems and jewel-encrusted slippers. Shangal was astonished by the palace, and as he drank his wine, he thought to himself, Is this paradise? Is it a garden where all one's companions exhale the scent of musk? In private, he said to Bahram that he would like to see his daughter, and the king gave orders that eunuchs from his entourage escort him there. As Shangal went with them, he saw other parts of the palace that were as beautiful as the spring, and then he saw his daughter, gloriously gowned, calm on her ivory throne, and nobly crowned. He kissed her forehead then, and bent to place his face against her radiant moonlike face. They wept in one another's arms, and he caressed her hands and his continually. He said, "You live in paradise, my dear. The palace that you left compared to here is ugliness itself, a noisome lair, impoverished, idolatrous, and bare." He gave her presents. He had brought purses of gold, crowns, and slaves, and they made her apartments look like the garden in springtime. Then he returned to Bahram, but saw that the festivities were breaking up. The nobles were tipsy with wine and calling for all kinds of bedding, ready to go to their sleep quarters. Shangal, too, decided to sleep. The musky cloak of night, spotted with stars like a leopard's hide, was spread, and all the wine drinkers slept until that golden goblet that we call the sun appeared. Night's cloak was pushed aside, and the plains glistened like yellow topaz. Bahram took the king of India hunting, and when they returned they sat to feasting again. Whether they were engaged in conversation, hunting, or feasting, Shangal was almost never absent from Bahram's side. Shangal went to his daughter and there asked for a pen, paper, and ink made from black musk. He wrote a proclamation, beginning with blessings on whom had cleansed the world of sorrow, spreading righteousness and justice so that evil and vile had become only the devil's portion. Then he wrote, I gave Sepanode to the famous King Bahram as his bride. May the King of Kings live forever, and all other nobles as his slaves. When I leave this fleeting world, I entrust Kanuj to King Bahram. Commit my dead body to the flames, and do not disobey Bahram. Hand my treasures over to him, and hand over to him too our country, its crown, its throne, and its armies. He gave this proclamation, written in Devagari script, on silk to Sepanod. Shangal stayed for 2 months in Persia. Then he sent a messenger to Bahram asking that he and his entourage be allowed to return home. Bahram agreed to his return to India and ordered his chief priest to select some Persian goods as presents. There were gold coins and royal jewels, innumerable swords, helmets and belts, and more brocades and uncut cloth than one could reckon. According to their rank, the men of his entourage were given horses caparisoned in Chinese brocades. Then the king cheerfully bade them farewell and went with them for their 3 stages of the journey. Not content with what he had already bestowed on them, he gave them enough fodder for their animals to last until they reached the border with India. When Bahram returned, he sat quietly on his throne and thought of the evil day of death. His heart was filled with pain and his face turned pale. He summoned his vizier and commanded him to inspect his treasuries and count the gold, jewels, and cloth he possessed. He did this because the words of his astrologer were troubling him. He had said, You will live for 80 years, and during the 4th must weep for death. Bahram had replied, I shall enjoy myself for 20 years, with partners for my journey throughout the world during the next 20. I shall act righteously and justly in private and in public, and during the 3rd 20 I shall stand before God and ask for his guidance. The astrologer had said 63 years, but the number 3 was obscure. It was his words that had made him think of his treasury enough that he usually paid little attention to his wealth. Blessed is the man who rules without trouble or self-indulgence, especially if he's the king. His vizier spent many difficult days reckoning up his wealth, and when he arrived at a figure, he returned thoughtfully to the king. He said, You have sufficient wealth to last for 23 years. I have taken into account provisions, the pay for your splendid army, and the expenses of messengers who come to your court from client kings and the provinces. Your treasury is full of gold and silver and other wealth, and will last for 23 years. When Bahram heard this and reflected on it, he stopped worrying about those things that were to come. He said, My reign is coming to a close. Consider, we've 3 days here, and of those tomorrow has not come. While yesterday has gone forever, and now and passed away, I won't be bent down by anxiety during the 1 day that is left to me. He gave orders that taxes on both the nobility and the commoners were to be remitted throughout the world. Then he established a priest in each town to wake up those who were asleep and act as a mediator in all disputes. He gave those men a stipend for food, clothes, and furnishings, said to them, Neither good nor evil must be hidden from me. Arbitrate among men and tell me of both the good and the bad, so that I can lay my fears of evil to rest. The priests went out into the world, and nothing, whether good or evil, remained hidden from them. They did as they were ordered, but letters came in from every province saying that wisdom was deserting men's minds, that the world was full of battles and bloodshed. The young did not respect their elders. Their hearts were puffed up with wealth, and they had no regard for the king or his priests. As the letters arrived, one after another, the king's heart became tired of bloodshed. He chose an administrator for each province, a man who was just, knowledgeable, and well qualified. These functionaries were given a stipend from the treasury and told to collect silver in the form of taxes from the area's subjects for 6 months. They sat in state and were crowned. For 6 months they collected taxes, and for 6 months distributed revenue, but they themselves were not to profit from the silver they collected. The intention was to stop the bloodshed caused by men being led astray, but the king's agents wrote to him that justice and security were disappearing from the world. The rich paid no taxes, but in their arrogance thought only of squabbles and arguments. When Bahram read these letters, his heart became bitter. He chose lords of the marches, righteous men, such as the situation required, gave them financial support for a year, and ordered them to apply God's law against those who were shedding blood, so that men should be at peace again. When some days had passed, he wrote to his agents who had scattered throughout the country, asking them to identify those that were harmful to his kingdom. They answered, "The king's liberality has meant that no one cares for the old and true ways. Agriculture is neglected. We see draft oxen wandering at will, and plants are growing indiscriminately in the fields and plains." He answered, "Men are not to rest from agricultural labor till midday, when the sun is high in the sky. But don't expect to get anything out of men who have nothing. When men don't work, it's from ignorance, and ignorance is something we should weep over. A man in that condition should be given a few coins to stave off hunger. If a man has neither seed nor livestock, don't act harshly with him. Help him with money to relieve his suffering. Do likewise when disaster strikes from the sky, since no man can rule the sky. If the ground is covered with locusts that eat all the crops, give the farmers a grant from the treasury, and have this proclaimed throughout the province. And if there is an uncultivatable or sterile area, as there is in all provinces, on the lands of both nobles and commoners, if any man tries to collect taxes on such an area, even if he were my own guardian, I'll bury him alive and curse his house." They set the king's seal on this letter, and messengers took it to all quarters of the land. Where there were poor men, he clothed them, and he wrote a letter to the provinces asking who lived well and who were destitute. "Tell me," he wrote, "what is happening in the world, and lead my heart toward the light." Answers came from the nobles in all provinces, saying, "We see that the land is flourishing, and everywhere blessings are called down upon you. But the poor complain about the king and about their bad luck. They say when the rich drink their wine, they have chaplets of flowers on their head, and they drink to all the accompaniment of musicians' songs. They don't consider us people at all, which is unwise of them. We have to drink our wine without music and without flowers." The king laughed aloud at this letter, and he sent a hard-riding messenger to Shangal, saying, "You must help me out now. Choose 10,000 of those Luris men and women both, who know how to play the lute. Send them to Persia so that they can entertain the poor here." Shangal read the letter, chose the Luris, and sent them to the king just as he had asked. When the Luris arrived at court, the king admitted them and gave an ox and a donkey to each of them, hoping to make farmers of them. He also donated 1,000 assloads of wheat so that they could use the animals to plow the land, sow the wheat, and so bring it to harvest. They were also to be musicians for the poor, so that commoners would be like the nobility. Off the Luris went, but they ate the oxen and the wheat, and by the end of the year their faces were pale with hunger. The king said to them, "You weren't supposed to waste the seed like this, and forget about seed time and harvest. Well, you still have donkeys. Load up your goods, and put your silk strings on your lutes." And now, because of his words, the Luris wander the world trying to make a living, traveling and stealing by day and night. 60 years passed, and the king was unacquainted in the world. At the new year, the wise priest, who was his vizier, came to him and said, The great king's treasury is empty, and I have come to hear your commands. The king replied, Do not trouble yourself. We no longer need such things. Abandon the world to its creator, who established the turning heavens. The heavens turn, and God remains, guiding both you and me towards the good. He slept that night, and at dawn the following morning a large crowd came to the court. All who should be there had come. Among them was the king's son, Yazdegerd. In front of the assembled nobles, Bahram gave him the crown, the royal torque, the diadem, and the ivory throne. He wished to devote his thoughts to God, and so gave away the crown and the throne. He was tired of the world's affairs, and when the dark night came, he tried to sleep. When the sun raised its hand in the sky, the king's vizier became anxious because the king had not risen, and he was afraid that Bahram had fled from the world. Yazdegerd went to his father's side, and when he saw him, the saliva froze in his mouth. The king's cheek had that withered color of death, wrapped in golden brocade. He had given up his soul. So this world is, and always has been. Do not torment your soul with greed and ambition. Even a heart of stone or iron fears death, and there is nothing you can do against it. You must act with humility, troubling no one, and if you want your past not to harm you, here, I remind you, men of Bahram's justice and generosity, and may no one think ill of his memory. They made him a royal tomb, and his people mourned his death. Bahram Gur was succeeded by his son Yazdegerd, who ruled for 18 years. He was succeeded by two of his sons, Hormazd, who reigned for only 1 year, and Perez, who ruled for 11 years. Perez was succeeded by his sons, Balash, who ruled for 5 years, and Kobad. During Kobad's reign, a man called Mazdak, who claimed to be a prophet, appeared. And here is where I end my tale for today. But I'll be back tomorrow with more tales. Many more tales. Until then, my friends,